we're going to focus on the topic through Paul, actually. So there's lots of different ways we could approach this. But it seems to me that the biggest stumbling blocks to people actually believing that God might want to give space to both men and women in equal terms and in mutual terms, both to serve in the kingdom with no barriers to what kind of service that might look like, whether that's teaching or leading a church or leading a denomination or serving the coffee and teaching the kids and doing whatever. But is it true that God really doesn't see gender as a barrier to those forms of service, or does he? And my experience of the evangelical church is that there is either a definite commitment to the idea that he does see gender as a barrier, or there is a lurking fear that he does see gender as a barrier. And I would like to address both those things. And it seems to me that the person who perplexes people most on this issue is Paul. Because when you look at Jesus and the way that he behaved, it's very difficult, apart from knowing that he had 12 male disciples, as we all know, but they symbolized, of course, the 12 tribes of Israel, and he did have female disciples. So Jesus, when you look at the way that Jesus behaved, gender was not a barrier to Jesus' ministry in any shape or form. There was nothing that he did for the men that he didn't do for the women. There was no anointing for the men that there wasn't for the women. There was no calling for the men that there wasn't for the women. So I think it's easy to make a case if one wanted to. It's much harder with Paul. And so we're going to do some work together today to look at our own assumptions, look at scripture, and I really do want it to be a time of questioning. I do various things in my life, and one of them is to be a mum, which is a big thing for me, and the other is to be a principal, which is a big thing for me. But really, in my heart, I'm a teacher, and I think it's so important. If you want to learn, you actually have to learn for yourself, and you have to start questioning your own assumptions and working out what you really think. That's the most important thing. So that's what I'd like to give you a chance to do today. What we're actually going to do to start with is I'm going to get you into groups to begin with, and then come back, and then you're going to feed back to me. And I'm going to ask you to do various things. Now, I've written a book. I've got ink all over myself. I knew there was one of my pens that was leaking. And of course, it's the one that I took out. It doesn't matter.
You keep talking. I'll get you a cloth.
Okay, thanks. I've written a book on 1 Corinthians 11 to 14. Oh, that would be helpful. And in this passage, in these chapters, these 4 chapters, thank you, there are 3 very tricky passages. And they are 11, 2 to 16, if you want to jot these down, 14, 20 to 25, probably extends a bit before that as well, and 14, 33 to 36. And I got very interested in these passages because I'm very interested in Paul, and he fascinates me as a person. And ever since I was filled with the Spirit when I was 23 and read the Bible all the way through, which is what I did for the first time in my life, by the time I'd got to Paul, I was just fascinated. And I read his letters, and I go back to them all the time. So he as a person interests me, And these passages particularly interesting, so this became an interest of mine. And I want to take you on a journey with them, which begins with asking you to find all the difficulties in these passages that you can. Now, I do this, I've done this a number of times, and I not being rude, but young people, obviously you're very young, but people younger than you find it easier to do it. And they more easily come up with more problems. So the longer you've been in church, the harder you will find this exercise, honestly. Unless you have a slightly more rebellious temperament, in which case you will find a lot. So one of the things that I like to say to people, without being disrespectful, is pretend it's not the Bible and then think what you would like to say. So imagine that you're doing a literary criticism of these passages. And so you're trying to find problems at all sorts of different levels. You're trying to find problems in the ideas, in the theology, in the expression, in the construct, everything, and see what you come up with, okay? So I can tell you that the hardest passage out of all of them, oh, thank you, look at this, it's perfect. Yeah, thank you, is 11:2-16. And you could spend all your time on that, which would be fine. If anyone wants to look at the others, that would be interesting. And they're sort of simpler to comment on. So I'm going to give you 15 minutes in your groups, and then you're going to come back and feed back to me what you see, and then we'll take it from there. So what I want is feedback from your groups, just to tell me. You don't have to give everything, because there are, how many groups? 4. So maybe don't give everything. Give us a starter, and then people will have a chance to add other things.
There seem to be a lot of contradictions.
Right.
So, for example, hierarchy, male and female, both created in the image of God in Genesis 1, but here it just talks about men being made in the image of God. What is it about men that appears to be more important than women? Also the hierarchy within the Godhead, which isn't really explained. The head of Christ is God. What does that mean? What does head itself mean? What does the word mean? It could be used in different ways throughout the passage. Very confusing, all this stuff about head coverings and shaving, and why is the length of your hair important? Is it a cultural thing or a spiritual thing? Mm-hmm. Because clearly throughout history, fashions for hair length and for men and women has changed.
Thank you. That's fantastic. Thank you.
Yeah, you've covered a bit of what we said, especially about the contradictions. Verse 3, the head of woman is man. There's like a chain of command going on there that we're not so sure about. Verse 8 suggests women is a possession of men, so women were created for men. We didn't like that much. Verse 13 says, "Judge for yourselves?" ? We had a bit of a discussion about that. Why are you sort of pushing it back? Judge for yourselves. And verse 16 suggested if you didn't like it, tough, and we didn't like it really. So.
Yeah, great.
You see why we have problems on our staff team
Thank
here.
you.
Let's just say, right, okay, Ash.
Lots of people covered it already. So verses 3, 7, 8, 10. Because of the angels was an interesting one. What on earth does because the angels mean?
Yeah.
The kind of odd bit in verse 3 about the head of Christ is God, which I think Paul said at the beginning.
Yeah.
That prompted all the kind of ministry people in our group to start using that as a means to unlock the passage and possibly look about where it can't be then about subordination, because that doesn't work in that context, which is interesting. Talked about hair fashions and length and probably further evidence that Boris Johnson should not become Prime Minister. That is the Antichrist.
God has spoken, definitely.
No need for that either. Aaron.
Yeah, we covered much of what's been said, but I think we didn't really land anywhere. But if it is a hierarchy,
Yeah.
then that does not necessarily equate to value of the people in the hierarchy. For example, in my house, there is a hierarchy where my children are under me and my wife, but if you ask me, I would say that they are more valuable than I am to myself. So just because there is a hierarchy doesn't denote value, was one of the things. And the other thing that we were talking about is if it is a hierarchy, if it is a God-ordained hierarchy, it's not necessarily a threat, but it's actually a covering and a protective thing. Now, bear in mind that my group was 80% women, so that's mostly their opinions that's coming out there, I think.
Thank you.
There are many more women here than men, aren't there? That's good. That's a good thing. I think that's the 4 groups.
Oh, great. Okay. There are various things that jump out at any reader, I think, right? That if one is honest and you look at the passage, and we haven't talked about 14:20 to 25 or 14:33 to 36, which have further problems. So 14:20 to 25 is the passage about believers and unbelievers and speaking in tongues and prophecy. And Paul spends this long preamble telling the Corinthians that prophecy is the intelligible language and tongues is the unintelligible language. And so tongues should be a private endeavor, and prophecy should be the thing that we do in public unless tongues is interpreted. And then so you're thinking, he's set you up to say prophecy, therefore, is for unbelievers, and that's what he follows with, because if you prophesy and an unbeliever walks in, what happens? They will declare, exactly. So they'll be convicted of their sins, they'll fall on their knees, and they'll say, God is among you. So prophecy is valuable for whom? You think. But in verse 21, what does he say? He does. And J.B. Phillips, who was one of the translators of the Bible and did a paraphrase of the Bible, got to this point. He got so stuck with it, he actually just swapped them round. He thought it was so wrong, he just swapped them. Because Paul suddenly says, prophecy is for believers and tongues are for unbelievers. And you're like, but you didn't say that. And then after that, you don't even go on to give an illustration that shows that. So why have you said that? And in 14:33 to 36, there is an injunction on women speaking in the church. But in 11, he's talked about women praying and prophesying, as long as they have a head covering on, you think. That's probably what it sounds like. Okay, so let's just look at some. So let's stay with 11. We've covered the others in a bit, in a way, just to sort of start the problems. So the first one, that if you look at the Greek, and scholars debate this, is whether this passage is actually about hairstyles or about head coverings. And that's because of verse 4, where there's an expression in Greek that is slightly uncertain, and it can either mean having down on the head or having down from the head. And because Paul also refers to hairstyles, as you noticed, because he says, doesn't nature teach you that it's a disgrace for a man to have long hair? He's clearly dealing with some sort of hair length thing. So is he dealing with hairstyles? Now, having read a lot about this passage, I would say that I think it's about both. I think there are references to head coverings and to hairstyles, and that there was an offence about men wearing head coverings and having long hair, and an offence about women going without head coverings and having kind of loose hair, okay? So I think there's references to both, but I think that the first section is definitely about head coverings, and the practice that is being spoken about here, which you're right, he comes out in verse 16 and says, if you don't do this, you are totally out of step with all the other churches. He's talking about head coverings in that thing. And the weight of scholarship is on that. Oh, sorry. So the next question would be, why does Paul want men to pray and prophesy with their heads uncovered? What is the theological or symbolic significance of that? Paul was Jewish and would have been used to men praying with their heads covered. And that would have been his practice as a Jew. So if he's changing the rules, why is he doing that? And what's the point? Why does he want women to pray and prophesy with their heads covered? So scholars, you guys brought up the question of, is it cultural or is this theological? Now, if I were just to do a poll, how many of you think that Paul is talking about a cultural issue here? How many of you think he's talking about a theological issue? Okay. What are the reasons that he gives for women wearing head coverings? Honor and shame is the result. What are the reasons? Not really. There are none. There are some. Why do you say that? Look before that. Yes. So what does he say? Read it out for us. Right, so why shouldn't a man not cover his head? Is that a cultural reason or a theological reason? It's a theological reason. And why should a woman cover her head? Because she's the glory of man. Now, you said here, because she is not the glory of God. And you said, because she is the glory of man. I've just written a paper on verse 7. And I was struggling to keep it down to 8,000 words, and I literally could have written a book. Literally, on the history of interpretation of verse 7. So the history of scholarship from the early church through to the modern day of a bunch of men saying, what on earth did Paul mean? And was he saying that because woman is the glory of man, that she is not the image and glory of God? Or was he not? Because that sounds wrong. So if we don't want to say that, then what are we going to say? So I could give you, but I can't, I could give you a whole history of how people have interpreted this one verse. But what I can tell you is that all of them, without exception, have said this is a real problem for us. We don't know how to navigate this. And so they try and weave things around it and twist it back into Genesis 1 because it doesn't fit with Genesis 1. So, you would think, but what language is he using? Well, I'll tell you later, but I want you to sit with the problems because they get worse and worse. They do. They get worse and worse, and the thing is, I don't want to skip over the problems because unless you feel them, you will not be driven to thinking, I would like a different solution. And one of the problems that I find with this passage is that people read it and read it and read it over and over and over again, and they keep missing what Paul is actually saying. Because I asked you, how many of you think that there is a theological reason for head coverings or not, and nobody put their hands up? And it's actually really plain in the text. It's a causal link in the Greek. For this reason. For this reason. That's verse 10. The reason is because man is the image and glory of God, and woman is the glory of man. And man wasn't made for woman, but woman for man. And that's the reason. Now, how does that sound to you? Let me ask the women first. Just really honesty, just be honest. How does it sound? How does it make you feel? That's a valid scholarly question, okay? So scholars like to pretend that somehow they rise above how things make them feel. That's absolute nonsense. Scholars are driven into the work they do because of things that it makes them feel. So my scholarly question for you women is, how does that make you feel that Paul taught that a woman should wear a head covering in church, a veil in church, because she is the glory of man, and she was made for man and created for him? You find it completely offensive. Doesn't fit. Okay, so can you tell me why? Dig a bit deeper into your feelings of uncomfortableness. Right. So it doesn't feel like revelation. It feels like some kind of imposition or some opinion. Okay. What else?
It feels like I'm having a dog taken away.
Right, okay. So it's quite serious, isn't it? Okay. That's why I'm going to keep going with it, because it's not that it's quite serious, the impact that it has on women. Sorry, now I should ask the men. How does it make you feel as a man? Awkward. Yeah. Thanks for the honesty. No, seriously. I really appreciate it when people are honest. Uncomfortable, right, you're uncomfortable, but you're not quite sure what to do with it. Yeah.
It just, because it's an issue that doesn't evoke that sort of emotion in me, I'm kind of like,
Yeah. No, I totally get that. And having read... Yeah, no, seriously, let me tell you, having read, probably, I don't know, I can't count anymore how many male commentators I have read on this passage. And the thing that I come back to over and over and over again is it doesn't have that impact on you. It doesn't, you're not feeling the impact that I'm feeling. It's making you feel something, some of them. And there's definitely this kind of uncomfortableness that starts, even from someone as early as Augustine. I will answer your question. And Chrysostom. And they start to be like, it feels like he's saying this, but we don't really want to go down there. And, but men are, because it says something different to them from what it says to the women. And so women will react differently, and therefore women will see something else. Okay. We evangelicals have a doctrine, have an idea, which is the perspicuity of Scripture. Have you heard this? That it's the idea that Scripture has its own sense, and it stems from this idea that you can give anyone the Bible and they will understand it, which is not a bad idea. Like, that's a good idea in principle, but in practice, this little book is an extremely complex book. And we won so much in the Reformation when the book was given to anyone and everyone, you know, ploughboys and women tending babies. But we lost the idea that actually if you start to pick it up and really let it question you and question it, you will need some help to understand it. So perspicuity I have mixed feelings about it, because I like the fundamental idea that we want the Bible to be for everyone, and it shouldn't be in the hands of the elite, right? Whether they're the priests or whether they're the learned or whether they're the men. But at some point, someone's got to bring something to help us. So, brilliant. Now, let me just, have I been clicking? Let me just quickly go through the rest of the problems. No. Should we have coffee? I've lost my thing. Yeah, because I'm just going to go, okay, so I'll just quickly. So who is this shaming and why is it shaming them? Okay, what's the source of the shame? So these are things you can think about over coffee. What is the relationship of a cultural practice? So head coverings is a cultural practice. And long hair or short hair and blah, 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 there's no rules. Well, there are. So what's the relationship between the rule and the theological principle? What does Paul see as the relationship of man to woman, woman to man, man to Christ, woman to Christ, Christ to God? That's very complex in the passage. And somebody mentioned bringing in 11.3 as a way of interpreting the rest of the passage. That's exactly what scholars do, and end up tying themselves in more knots than when they started. What is the penalty for a woman not doing what she's told? Just quickly. What does he say? She may as well shave her head. What did that mean? Total disgrace. People had their heads shaved as a punishment for adultery and prostitution. Right. Is it serious not to wear your head covering? Is it? Yes. And there are consequences. What happens to the men if they don't do what they're told? In the passage. Nothing. That's the way of the world. What's the theology of glory that Paul is expressing? What does Paul really believe? Does Paul really believe that attire, what we wear, carries theological significance in relation to gender roles and to God? That is what the passage is telling us. That's why you said you feel like it's just an opinion, because in your gut you're thinking, I don't think that that's what Christianity's about, is it? Do we all have to wear something now? Why? Who are the angels and why do they matter? Verse 10. Why does Paul appear to contradict himself? You guys picked that up straight away. So if you go up from 11 onwards, he seems to go back on himself, especially about this, but wait, men and women have a different role to each other. Why does he refer to praying and prophesying in verse 5 and just praying in verse 12? And how adamant is Paul that this should be done? And those are all some nice things to think about while we're having coffee. When you study the scholarship on this passage, which is what started to happen to me a few years ago, so my interest was piqued on this particular passage because I went to a conference by someone who'd done some work on Romans called Douglas Campbell. And he explained that Paul uses different styles of writing, and that sometimes he cites the people he disagrees with. Anyway, he's done a lot of huge tome on Romans, and I went to his conference, and I hadn't realized that, because I'm not a New Testament scholar or a Paul scholar. And so I came back with my interest piqued, and I started studying 1 Corinthians 11. That was my first stop. And the more I got into it, the more I thought, nobody knows what they're talking about. I mean, really, seriously, that is what I thought. And then I found all these really great scholars so Charlie Moore said that these verses still await a really convincing explanation. So this was from last century. Another, George Caird, it can hardly be said that the passage has yet surrendered its secret. I mean, this is like 50 years ago. Wayne Meeks is one of the most obscure passages in the Pauline letters. Craig Blomberg, this passage is probably the most complex, controversial, and opaque of any text of comparable length in the New Testament. A survey of the history of interpretation reveals how many different exegetical options there are for a myriad of questions, and should inspire a fair measure of tentativeness on the part of the interpreter. So basically, if anyone tells you they know what it means, be very, very skeptical, because the scholars don't say that. Now, let me read you. So Gordon Fee, who is he's still alive, bless him, and he's an amazing scholar, Pentecostal scholar, done a huge amount of work on 1 Corinthians. And in a footnote on this passage, he says there are particular exegetical difficulties surrounding the crucial terms in this passage, right? So he names the words that are causing problems for us, knowing what they actually mean. And these are the terms. Head, having down the head, I've talked to you that, the verse 4. Uncovered, glory, authority over her head, because of the angels, in the place of a shawl, and such a custom. He misses out in his list man and woman, which in some versions are translated as husband and wife. That is all the key terms in that passage. So what he's telling you is scholars cannot make up their minds about what these terms mean. They don't agree on it. And if you wanted to, you could read all of that. It's an absolute morass of complexity. So, it's kind of fascinating. Well, it fascinates me. So I went to a conference. So this started to interest me. And I went to a conference by Douglas Campbell. And here I heard about a particular rhetorical device that Paul uses. And everyone knows that he uses it, and everyone knows that he uses it in 1 Corinthians. Now, Douglas at the time was talking about using different words for this, like diatribe, and he had another Greek word called prosopopeia, which is like when you come and act out something in another voice, right? He's kind of modified some of his arguments on the rhetoric, but I would just like to stick with a rhetorical device. And so what I thought was, well, in 1 Corinthians, there are certain places where Paul quotes the Corinthians, because 1 Corinthians is actually 2 Corinthians. Paul has written the Corinthians a letter, and they have written one back, and he has written another one, which is 1 Corinthians, and then he writes another one, which is 2 Corinthians. And so 1 Corinthians is a response to something they've already written. Now, I don't know if you know the letter very well, but the letter is a whole series of issues that Paul has with the congregation and the leadership of this church. And he goes through a whole list of things. They've got strange ideas about angels, they've got strange ideas about the end times, the resurrection, sexual immorality. They've got the wrong practices over communion, so the rich are lording it over the poor, and there's this kind of whole list of things that he goes on, and some things are doctrinal and theological, and some things are practice, like you're doing the wrong thing rooted in the wrong theology. So, the crescendo, of course, is the end, where he deals with the resurrection, because that is the most important thing. And so he's correcting them, and scholars will tell you that he doesn't pull his punches in this letter. And the problem is that we're reading a translation, so it will come out as differently to us. But he is pretty forceful in the things that he's saying, and he does definitely want to get his own way. So when you read 1 Corinthians, you will find that there are certain phrases in quotes in your text. 1 Corinthians 8, there'll be something in the beginning there. And what has happened is that scholars have looked through, and so if you look up, it says, now about food sacrificed to idols, we know that, quote, we all possess knowledge, close quote. Yeah? Is that in your Bibles? You can have a quick look. There's no quotation mark there. So if you read it without that, now about food sacrificed to idols, we know that we all possess knowledge. It could say that, but editors have said, no, it doesn't say that. Paul's actually quoting the Corinthians at this point, because that will make most sense of what he's just about to say. So they put the quotation marks in, and they made a decision on that. There's no punctuation like that in his letters. But it doesn't mean that he's not doing it, so we know he's doing it in 1 Corinthians. So I started to play around with the idea that maybe he was doing this more in the bits where we didn't get him, and especially where there was a direct contradiction. Is it because actually there are two voices there, which is what it sounds like, that there are two voices operating at once. So I toyed around with that. So this is, Douglas has done the work on this, and this is just one of the quotes that he picks out. Good philosophers functioning as midwives tease out a correct understanding. So it's not that they don't approach a problem head on. They'll use rhetoric to say, this is what you're saying, this is what I'm saying, and there's a kind of to and fro in order to demonstrate that what they're saying is correct. Now, there are no clues or cues in 1 Corinthians, so I have done a breakdown of where I think that there is the voice of Paul and where I think there is the voice of the Corinthians, but I can't prove that, and I always say I can't prove it. It's a thesis. So it's a theory, and I put it forward in my book, Women in Worship, and I will show you how I think it works. But there's no way of knowing one way or the other. One of the questions that we face when we're reading these texts is assumptions about patriarchy and whether men, someone mentioned hierarchy, and we're dealing with a world where patriarchy was unquestioned. It was right, and it was God ordained, or the gods had ordained it, or nature had ordained it, because men were stronger, more intelligent, and just basically superior. So one of the questions that I'm interested in, and we can't sort of cover it all today, is whether Paul actually was essentially patriarchal, or whether his theology was subverting patriarchy and coming against it. Traditional readings will do very quickly and easily what you guys did, which is just to slip into an assumption that this is cultural, because it makes it easier for us. So without really exploring how problematic it is, you will read a commentary and they will keep falling back onto the idea that there was some sort of cultural thing operating, but they'll never really spell it out. Then some people will be honest and say, we know there's a theology behind this, and it's really difficult to square with Genesis 1, and it's kind of a weird rendition of Genesis 2, but even then we don't get that, because then he contradicts himself in verse 11 and 12. And so there are people who will unpack all the complexity, but a lot of people won't. And even really, really good scholars will end up saying, yeah, it's cultural in the end. And so that's why we don't have to do it anymore, because it's just cultural. But if you want to look up, there's a website called the Head Coverings Movement. Yeah, there is. And they are campaigning for women to go back into head coverings. And there are some scholars involved with this movement on the basis of this passage, and that this is Paul giving a theological rationale, and that it's enduring. So it's apostolic, it's theological, and in verse 16 he says, well, if you don't do it, you're going against all the churches. Now, I think they're right. I think that if this is Paul, I think that is the correct way of reading this passage, which is why I got to the point where I thought, I don't think this is Paul. I think it makes more sense if it's not. And I think it doesn't just make sense within the passage itself, so it brings an internal coherence to the passage, but it also makes sense with the letter, which is a letter about the shame that Paul knows as an apostle. So why is the person who wrote 1 Corinthians 2 and 1 Corinthians 4 about the shame that he has had to endure as an apostle of Christ, and that he is the lowest of the low, and he's on the bottom rung, and he's like the scraping off the bottom of the shoe? Why is that person who experiences shame all his life because he has given himself to Jesus Christ, and that he has pledged to just preach Christ crucified and nothing else, and that he was a very, very important Jew who gave up everything for Jesus Christ? Why is he suddenly so concerned that this church should look like they are honoring something by putting women in head coverings? Match them up. And I struggle to match them up. So even in 1 Corinthians, I'm struggling. And then when you look at Paul's wider thought, I'm struggling even more, because Paul has this very developed temple theology. And this, I think, is really important. I'm probably going completely off my presentation, but that doesn't matter, because this is more important. And it'll be somewhere in the presentation. But Paul, if you read Ephesians 2, you will get to the real heart of Paul, his temple theology. And it will also make sense of Galatians 3:28 for you. So Paul talks in Ephesians 2 about the wall of hostility that has been taken down between the Jew and the Gentile. And the Jew and the Gentile have become one new man, one new person. They are no longer divided anymore. But where are they no longer divided? They're no longer divided because they are in Christ and because they have had one baptism. So the one baptism that we all share is the thing that makes us one person as the church in Christ. Now, what Paul is referring to when he's talking about the dividing wall of hostility is the temple. And the temple that Paul would have known and Jesus would have known is a temple where you would go into the first section, and in the first section, the women and the children and the Gentiles and the lepers would have been allowed. So any of the Jews that were unclean would have had to stay in that section. The next section would be for Jewish men, and none of those guys would have been able to go through, so we women would not have been allowed, and neither would the Gentiles. The next section, further in towards the Holy of Holies, is for the Levites, so the priests. So there are divisions between women and men, between Gentiles and Jews, between non-clerical and priestly caste, and then the Holy of Holies, where the high priest goes in once a year. There's your hierarchy for you, yes? Of superiority and inferiority, of proximity to God and further away from God. Now, Paul knows that that has been abolished. He is taken by Jesus Christ. He is utterly decimated as a Jewish man. He is blinded. He is taken out into the desert. He is schooled by the Lord Jesus himself for 3 years. He says, I didn't go to Jerusalem. I wasn't taught by people. I was taught by revelation. And the thing that he comes back with is, and now I'm the apostle to the Gentiles. I'm the apostle to the unclean. I'm the apostle to the people who are the scum. Because we are the superior race, and they are not deserving of coming close to God. Oh, but wait, now they are. So what has Paul seen? He's seen that the heart of the gospel is that Jew and Gentile will come together as one man, and there is no division anymore. And that's what he's writing in Galatians 3:28. So it's directly applicable to worship. Is when we come to worship. Jews were segregated in their worship. Christians are not segregated. There is no differentiation in worship between what? Jew and Gentile, slave and free, male and female. The barriers have been annihilated. Map Ephesians 2 onto Galatians 3:28, onto 1 Corinthians 11, and what do you get? Discordance. Don't you? You have to. You cannot read all those texts together and think that's going to work. Because why would the man who thinks that the barriers should be erased and goes on a few verses later to say, and by the way, when I say there's no barriers, you rich guys, get out the way. Get out of the way for the poor. Why is he going to say, but girls, put your head coverings on? Because you're lacking something. Now that's the theological message, and you cannot get round that. I've tried. I have pushed very hard on this theology to try, and I've tried to listen to the benefit of the doubt, and I've tried to get round the ways that people twist it around. And my conclusion is this, that if you take that theology at face value, at the value that it's given to you in verses 7 to 10, women are missing something. We're lacking something. Whether it's something to do with the image, whether it's something to do with the glory, we're missing something, whether it's authority, whether it's our own authority or whether it's a conferred authority, there's a lack. And this lack is going to cause shame. And so in order to guard everyone from the shame of the lack, Paul is saying, wear a head covering, and that will work. Now, really honestly, does that sound like a Christian idea to you? Honestly? No, it really doesn't. But that is the message of this text. So, my theory, you've got various options. You could say Paul was muddled. So he says this, and he's got this idea of kephale, which he does, by the way, and we haven't got time to do all of that. But he has taught them about kephale, which is why I think he begins the whole section. But I want you to have understood. So the grammar there should be translated like that. So I praise you for remembering me in everything and for holding to the traditions just as I passed them on to you. Now, John Chrysostom, he was a 4th century bishop and extremely intelligent. And he says about this verse, he's like, I know Paul's getting at something that he's already taught them. So some of them are obeying and some of them are not obeying. So, because otherwise he might have said, don't you know, which is what he uses in other, don't you know, haven't you realized? So here he's sort of got this soft entry into this topic. I praise you for remembering me in everything and for holding on to the traditions just as I pass them on to you. Now, I think what he's praising them for is they have some theology of kephale, which means head in Greek. And there's bits of it that are okay. Now, if you have been in church for a long time, and if you've been a pastor, and if you've done any theology or any church history, you'll know that the church is made up of people who think things, bits of which are okay and bits of which are not okay. And theologians talk about that as being orthodox and unorthodox. What they mean by that is right and wrong, but they try and make it sound nicer. And sometimes they'll even talk about heresy, which doesn't sound so nice, which is the same way of saying the same thing, that all of us are heretics in some manner. So nobody has got all their doctrine all sewn up and tied up and, perfectly right. But imagine what it's like when you've got a whole bunch of new converts. They've all converted. You've converted them all out of a pagan and Jewish and Roman and Greek. And then you've brought them all together and then you've gone. And you've left them to their own devices. Well, they've had all sorts of ideas in your absence, which we know, which he's trying to correct. So I think that they had a theology of kephale, and some of it was okay, and some of it had gone way off the rails. So I want you to have understood, that is actually what the Greek says. I want you to have understood that the head of every man is Christ, tick, that's okay, we can go with that. The head of the woman is her husband. I think that's what he means. That's fine, because he teaches that in Ephesians 5. You could talk about that later. I'm going to write a book with that in it. And the head of the woman is her husband. And then he finishes on his most important point. But the head of Christ is God. So what I'm telling you guys is, this head thing is fine, but the head of Christ is God. And why is that important? Because God is going to be all in all, which is what he teaches at the end. And when you look ahead in verse 12, he comes back to this idea. For as the woman came from man, so also man is born of woman. But what? But everything comes from God. So he's saying, let's just reframe this kephale thing, which I taught you, and there's good things in it. But actually, God is the head of Christ, and everything comes from God. So all these gendered things that you've brought out of my kephale teaching, let's just put that under this whole big umbrella, that everything comes from God. And that's what we're going to come back to. And then I think that in verse 4, he cites the Corinthians. So it doesn't take me very long just to run through this, because I think that if you start to see it, it kind of makes sense. If you don't think it makes sense, it doesn't matter. I don't take things personally. But I think that in verse 4, Paul is referring to their rules that they have implemented. So I think that they have an idea that they've taken out of his idea of headship. And I think that they have a patriarchal and male-centered idea of creation, which would be very normal for people in Corinth at that time. I think that the men have taken over since Paul has left, and they've implemented oppressive practices for women. Now, funnily enough, that's not so hard to imagine. And so this is the Corinthians, I believe, who have started teaching this. Every man who prays or prophesies with his head covered dishonors his head, but every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head. So they've taken this kephale idea, and they've said, well, if we're all related and we all have a kephale, the women don't have one, because the man is her kephale and Christ is his kephale. So it would be shameful for her to turn up without something covering her head, whereas the man is a glorious being. And we know that the Corinthians had a theology of glory where they thought they had already become angelic, glorious beings. And Paul actually corrects that in 1 Corinthians, and he says, no, the glory is still to come. You haven't yet become glorious beings. So I think that they thought that in this hierarchical system where the men are at the top and the women are at the bottom, that the men needed to let the glory shine, and so they didn't have head coverings, but the women somehow were going to shame them and the angels and God, because the angels are watching, which is what they would have thought, and so they needed to be covered. And they'd taken it so far that they had made it into a rule in the church, and they'd even threatened, or perhaps they had written in their letter, oh, come on, Paul, you know that this is a problem, and that we think if women go with their heads uncovered, they may as well turn up looking like prostitutes. They may as well turn up looking like, they're dressed in next to nothing. And so we're going to enforce this rule. So I think Paul says, he's still dealing with their ideas. But every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head. It's the same as having her head shaved. So imagine him giving this back to them in a kind of a question. It's the same, really? It's equivalent to a woman having her head shaved? So what are you going to do then? Well, how far are you going to take this? This is what I think he's doing back to them. For if a woman doesn't cover her head, she might as well have her hair cut off. But it's a disgrace for a woman to have her hair cut off. Then she should cover her head. So what he's doing is he's exposing the trap that they have trapped women in. Now, even Chrysostom, who doesn't obviously think that Paul is dealing with Corinthian ideas, thinks that this is a reductio ad absurdum, that Paul is using a rhetorical device just to say, this is where you could take this idea to show something. Well, I think he is doing that to take this idea to show them how coercive they are being and why he doesn't agree with them. And so I think that verse 7 is Corinthian theology, 7, 8, and 9. A man ought not to cover his head, since he is the image and glory of God, but woman is the glory of man. For man did not come from woman, but woman from man. Neither was man created for woman, but woman for man. Now, there are seeds of that theology in Genesis 2, not Genesis 1. So there are two creation stories. Genesis 1 is 26 and 27, is where God creates man and woman together in his image. And there it's in his image and likeness. There's no mention of glory. In Genesis 2, God creates a creature, a human creature, and then out of this creature, he takes out of the side of this creature and creates a man and a woman who become a married couple. So they come together. It's the first marriage. So there's a blending in Genesis 2 between the creation of all humanity and the picture of the first marriage. And so actually people will shuffle between those two and it's difficult to work out, are we talking about all men and all women, or are we talking about the first marriage in relation to every other marriage that is ever going to happen? But actually Genesis doesn't, it kind of leaves it open. It's sort of talking about both. So there's something about male and female which is designed to live together, even if you don't live together in marriage relations. But there's also something about marriage and the one flesh and these two different people coming together and creating more human beings and having this deep, intimate union together. So there's two things happening at once in different directions. And this theology in 11 is going back towards that, but it's a bit twisted, right? It's a bit off. It's a bit kind of, wait, yeah, you could say that, but isn't there something more than that? Is that really the end of it? That woman's just made for man and, and that's it? So somehow she has some sort of secondary status, or what does it mean? And so I think that's their theology. And so when you get to 11 and 12, Paul's actually giving you his theology. This is him. And this is what he thinks. And every single commentator breathes a sigh of relief when they get to verse 11. Because they're just like, now we're back on familiar territory. Now it's okay. So what some of them will do is they just kind of ignore the first bit and prioritize the second. And they say, well, this is clear, and Paul overrides it. And in verse 11, he says, nevertheless, now this word in Greek is very, very emphatic, and it means more something like, the point is, so Paul's, what I'm saying, the point is that in the Lord, woman is not independent of man, nor is man independent of woman. For as woman came from man, so also man is born of woman, but everything comes from God. Now, this rhetorical question, I think, is where Paul is heading towards getting them to admit that women should not be covered. So he says, judge for yourselves. Is it proper, is it fitting, he's saying, for a woman to pray to God with her head uncovered? So he doesn't say anything about in the worship or at certain times, or he's just asking them a question. Is it proper? Is it fitting for a woman to pray to God with her head uncovered? And I think that by this stage, he's really wanting them to go, yes, it would be okay. And he goes on, he says this very, very strange thing. Now, my theory about this is that verse 14 is taking one of their ideas and he's kind of teasing them with it. And the reason I think this is because, first of all, it's a very, very strange use of the term nature here. Does not the very nature of things, or does not nature teach you? That's what he's saying. Does not nature teach you that if a man has long hair, it's a disgrace to him? Well, does nature teach you that? No. Does God teach that? Did Jesus have long hair? We don't know. But did Jews have long hair? And do you know who had long hair in Corinth? Paul. Paul took a vow when he went to Corinth not to cut his hair. And he was in Corinth for 18 months. Now, you can see this in Acts 18. 18:18, he shaves his head when he leaves Corinth because of a vow that he'd taken. Now, what scholars say there in Acts is that Paul probably took a Nazirite vow when he went to Corinth, which would have been part of his whole picture of, his prayer. And so he didn't cut his hair while he was in Corinth. And hair grows approximately about 1/2 inch a month on a healthy person. And so Paul would have had hair that was 9 inches long if he'd had no hair to start with, but he probably had a bit to start with. So imagine Paul with 10-inch long hair, that's longer than mine. And imagine the Corinthians being embarrassed that Paul had long hair. And imagine them saying to him, Paul, everybody knows that long hair is disgraceful. And what do you think he would do? Laugh. Why is long hair disgraceful? Who's taught you that? And so he says to them, you know the very nature of things teaches you that if a man has long hair, it's a disgrace to him, because that's what you used to say to me. And then he uses it. I think this is kind of a joke, but he's serious. But if a woman has long hair, it's her glory. They also would think that. And that's a Jewish idea, and it's also, it appears in other religions, that hair is glorious. If a woman has long hair, it's her glory. So he's pointing out their own inconsistencies in their own thought. Even you think that long hair is glorious on a woman. So why are you making her cover it? For long hair is given to her, and the word there is instead of. It's not as. For long hair is given to her instead of a covering. And then I think verse 16 is him saying, if you disagree with me on that women shouldn't have head coverings, you are out of step with me and all my other churches. One of the other things that people do regularly point out is that if Paul really had wanted to bring in head coverings as a rule across all his churches, why is it not mentioned in any of his other letters? So there are multiple inconsistencies in this passage. I think there is a possible solution. You don't have to go with my solution, but if you don't, then you really, really do need to admit that it's so problematic that we definitely need to shelve it for a very long time until someone can come up with an answer. And we definitely shouldn't be using it to put women in head coverings, let alone teaching that women need to be under some kind of covering authority, which is what is taken out of these verses, because these verses are totally opaque. That is my opinion and my conclusion. Thank you very much.